The boy who walked into the storm. The rain was falling hard in Boston that morning. The streets were shining with water, and the wind blew cold against the windows of Harvard University. Inside one of the great lecture halls, students waited quietly for their guest professor to arrive. But this was no ordinary day. A boy was coming who no one expected. At the front of the room. Professor Eliot sat with his hands folded, staring at the door. He was one of the sharpest minds at Harvard, known for his brutal questions and impossible challenges. If anyone claimed they were smart, he would test them until they broke. And today he planned to do the same. The boy was just 15 years old. He wore a thin sweater and carried a notebook too big for his small hands. He walked in quietly, his eyes on the ground, his shoes wet from the rain. "You're Sundar Pichai's son?" The professor asked loudly so everyone could hear. The boy nodded, looking up with calm eyes. "Yes, sir." Some of the students chuckled under their breath. Others leaned forward to see what would happen. Who was this boy who thought he could face Professor Eliot? The professor stood and walked slowly around the boy. "Your father is the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world," he said. "So I assume you think you're very clever." The boy shook his head. "No, sir. I don't think I'm clever, but I want to learn." Professor Eliot narrowed his eyes. He was not used to humility. He pointed to a chair in the center of the room. "Sit there. Let's see if you can answer just one question correctly." The boy sat. His sweater dripped onto the floor. His hands rested on the notebook in his lap. The professor began pacing. "Imagine," he said, "you are in a sinking boat. The water is pouring in faster than you can pour it out. On the boat with you are two people, your father and a stranger. You can only save one. Which do you save?" The room went completely quiet. The boy looked down at his hands. The students watched closely, some smiling cruelly, waiting for him to fail. The boy raised his eyes and answered softly, "I would save the stranger." The professor froze. The students gasped. "You would let your father drown?" Eliot asked. His voice rising got the boy's cheeks turned red, but his voice stayed steady. "Yes, sir. Because my father taught me that every life has equal value. The stranger has nobody to save him. But my father, he already saved me." The room stayed silent. Even Professor Eliot didn't speak out, but then he stepped closer. "You think that is a clever answer, don't you?" he said harshly. "You think that makes you wise?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir. It's just what my father taught me." Professor Eliot leaned back, watching him. "Very well," he said finally. "But let's see how long you can keep answering." He pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and slapped it down on the table. 15 more questions, he said. "If you get even one wrong, you fail. Are you ready?" The boy closed his notebook and looked up at him. "Yes, sir." The professor's eyes narrowed. "You will regret saying yes." He whispered. And then he read the first question. The boy listened carefully, his hands steady. But outside, the rain began to pour even harder. A loud crack of thunder shook the windows, and somewhere deep in the hallways of the university, a strange sound echoed, as if something much bigger than a test was coming for the boy. The students felt it too. They began whispering to each other, unsure if this was still just a test or something more. The professor smiled faintly, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, as if he had just realized what kind of boy he was really dealing with. Sat up straighter and opened his mouth to answer the first question. And that's when the lights in the lecture hall flickered and went out, leaving them all in silence and darkness. Asterisk. The darkness reveals the truth. Room was swallowed by darkness. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The lights above had gone out so suddenly, it felt almost planned, though no one could say how. At the front of the room, the professor stood completely still, one hand gripping the edge of the table as though steadying himself. The boy's face was lit only by the faint glow of the storm outside, and even in the dim light his eyes seemed calm, almost expectant. As though he had known all along that something like this would happen, the students began to murmur among themselves. Some chuckled nervously, pretending not to care. Others fumbled with their phones to turn on flashlights, but for some reason no light seemed to cut through the gloom fully. It was not just the absence of light, but the presence of something heavier, a silence so thick it pressed against their chests and made the air hard to breathe. Professor Elliot was the first to speak. "Stay seated," he said sharply, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty now. "It's just a power cut, nothing to panic about." His words, however, sounded less like command and more like a suggestion he was trying to convince himself of. But the boy did not move. He kept his hands folded neatly on the notebook in his lap, his shoulders straight, his gaze fixed ahead. It struck some of the students in that strange stillness that he seemed out of place, not because of his age or his quietness, but because he seemed to belong to some other kind of silence. A deeper kind. Outside the windows, the storm raged. Louder. Branches lashed against the glass, and somewhere far off came the long, low wail of a siren. The sound gave way to another crack of thunder, so close it made the floorboards tremble. Then a voice, unfamiliar and cold, cut through the darkness. "Do you know why you're really here?" It was not Professor Elliot who had spoken. His eyes went wide as the words hung in the air, and he looked around quickly, as if searching for the source. But it was no use. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A few of the students gasped. One girl at the back dropped her phone, and the clatter of it against the floor was deafening in the quiet. The boy finally lifted his head fully and spoke, softly but clearly. "Yes," he said, "I know." Professor Elliot snapped his head toward him. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, though his voice cracked slightly on the last word. The boy didn't answer the professor. Instead, he turned toward the center of the room where the darkness seemed thickest and said again, "I know why I'm here." The silence that followed was different this time. It was not empty but charged, as though the very air was waiting for what came next. And then a figure began to form in the shadows. At first it was nothing more than a shape, a vague outline in the gloom, but soon it became clear that it was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old, tattered coat. The students shrank back instinctively, and even Professor Elliot took a step behind his desk. The boy did not flinch. The figure moved closer, though its feet made no sound against the floor. When it finally came into the faint light of the storm, its face could just barely be seen, lined, pale and sad in a way that hurt to look at. "So you remember me," the figure said at last, its voice soft now, almost kind. The boy nodded. "Who is this?" the professor demanded, his voice growing louder to hide his fear. "Is this some kind of trick? Who are you?" The figure ignored him completely. It kept its eyes on the boy. "You have a choice," it said. "You can leave now and forget all of this, or you can stay and finish what your father began. But if you stay, you cannot go back." The student stared, too shocked to speak. The boy drew in a long breath. His hands tightened around his notebook for the first time since he had arrived. He stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor, and looked the figure straight in the eyes. "I will stay," he said. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. Then it gave the smallest of nods. "So be it." At that moment, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. Asterisk, but something had changed in the room. The air felt heavier, the students looked smaller, and the boy's presence seemed to fill the space in a way none of them could quite explain. Professor Elliot stared at him, his mouth half open, at a loss for words. But before he could speak, the boy opened his notebook, and there, on the first page, though no one had seen him write it, was a message, scrawled in dark ink. "The next question decides everything." Professor Elliot swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the sheet of questions he had prepared earlier. He read the second question aloud, his voice uneven now. "What would you sacrifice? To save what you love most?" The boy raised his eyes slowly, meeting the professor's gaze. But this time, something behind his eyes was different. There was no hesitation, no fear, only a quiet strength that made even Professor Elliot take a step back. The boy opened his mouth to answer. And then, before he could speak, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the windows like angry hands. And deep below the floor, a sound rose, not thunder, not wind, but something darker, older, and closer. The students clung to their desks, staring at the boy who stood alone at the center of the room, notebook in hand, ready to speak as the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The answer that opened the door ground kept trembling, low and relentless, like some great beast shifting beneath the floor. The sound came from deep below, a deep groan that seemed to crawl into the bones of everyone. The students clutched their desks, their faces pale now, stripped of the smug curiosity they'd worn when the boy first walked in. Even Professor Elliot, who prided himself on being uncheckable, stood frozen behind his desk, fingers gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles whitened. But the boy, he didn't move. His thin sweater still clung to him from the rain. His notebook still rested calmly in his hands. His eyes, steady and dark, were fixed on the professor, as though none of this chaos mattered. As though the storm and the shaking were simply part of the question itself. Outside, the storm reached a furious pitch. Hail began to hammer the windows, loud and sharp like shattered glass. The lights flickered overhead, threatening to fail again. And through it all, the boy stood at the center of the room, a small figure against the roar, waiting for his moment. Professor Elliot swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Well?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly despite his effort to keep it firm. "What would you sacrifice to save what you love most?" The boy blinked slowly, and then, with deliberate care, he closed his notebook. The quiet click of its shutting seemed louder than the storm. He took a breath and spoke, his voice calm, but carrying somehow through the noise. "I would sacrifice myself," he said. "Completely, if it meant they could live. If it meant they could be free of what's coming." At those words, the tremor and the floor deepened, so strong now that dust rained down from the ceiling and hairline cracks spread across the walls, like spider webs. Some of the students gasped and scrambled to their feet, looking wildly around for an exit, but the doors remained shut, as though welded into place. Professor Elliot's mouth opened, but no sound came. He stared at the boy as though truly seeing him for the first time. Then the boy spoke again, softer now, but with a strange certainty. "That's what my father taught me," he said. "He said if you ever want to save what matters, you must first let go of yourself, of your pride, of your fear, of everything you think you are. Because only then do you understand what really matters." He turned slightly, his gaze moving to the floor as the sound beneath them grew louder. His fingers traced the cover of his notebook as though he already knew what would come next. At that moment, a faint line of light appeared on the floor in front of him. It was thin at first, no wider than a hair, but it glowed faintly golden, cutting through the dust and darkness. The students fell silent as they watched it widen, splitting the tiles of the floor apart. Professor Elliot backed away, shaking his head. What is this?" he whispered. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he knelt down slowly and placed his hand on the glowing crack. The light flared under his palm, so bright the students shielded their eyes. A low voice, the same one they had heard before, cold, heavy, ancient, spoke again, filling the room from nowhere. "You have answered truly," it said, "and now the door will open." The floor split further, and a circle of light formed around the boy, sharp and perfect, humming with energy. The ground inside the circle began to sink, lowering him slowly, as though some unseen platform was carrying. And downward, the students pressed themselves against the walls, terrified but unable to look away. Even Professor Elliot stood frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling. As the boy descended, he lifted his eyes to the professor. There was no fear in them, only a quiet sadness and something like forgiveness. "I told you I would stay," the boy said. Ben, before anyone could respond. The circle of light flared brighter, and the floor closed behind him with a deafening crack. The storm outside stopped instantly. The windows ceased to rattle, the hail disappeared, and the silence that followed was so sudden it rang in their ears. The room was whole again. But the boy was gone. Professor Elliot stumbled forward, staring at the spot where the boy had stood. Just moments ago. His chest rose and fell quickly, and for once, his sharp tongue could find no words. The students exchanged glances, whispering nervously to one another. Some wept softly, others just stared at the floor. Then, without warning. The boy's notebook, which had vanished with him, landed back on the center desk with a heavy thud. The cover was slightly charred now. The edges faintly glowing. Professor Elliot approached it slowly, his hand hovering over the cover before finally flipping it open. On the first page, in bold dark strokes, were 3 words none of them understood. Test begins, and then the lights flickered again. The windows darkened, and somewhere deep below the floor came a sound that made everyone's blood run cold. Not thunder, not wind, but the faint, rhythmic beating of a heart. Impossibly large and growing louder with each second. Asterisk the heart of the storm. Sound of the heart beneath the floor grew louder, steady and terrifying in its rhythm. It pulsed through the walls, through the air, through the very bones of everyone in the room. No one dared speak. No one moved. The students pressed themselves against the walls, some with their hands over their ears, others with their eyes squeezed shut, as though that would somehow make the sound stop, but it didn't stop. It only grew stronger, deeper, more alive. Professor Elliot stood at the center of the room, his hand still hovering over the boy's notebook. He stared at the 3 words on the page. The test begins, and for the first time in his long career, he felt truly powerless. His mind, which had always been sharp and uncheckable, felt dull now, useless in the face of something he could neither explain nor control. He shut the notebook with trembling fingers and stepped back, his eyes darting to the other students. They stared back at him, wide-eyed, silently begging him to fix this, to say something that would make sense of what was happening. But he had no words for them. Then the notebook opened by itself. The pages fluttered wildly as though caught in a great wind, though the air around them was still. The students gasped as the pages stopped abruptly on a blank sheet near the middle of the book, and slowly, as though an invisible hand held the pen, words began to write themselves across the page. One of the girls at the back whispered the words aloud as they appeared. Her voice thin and shaky. The boy has chosen. Now the question is yours. Professor Elliot swallowed hard. What does that mean? He muttered, though deep down he already feared the answer. The heartbeat beneath the floor thudded louder now, so strong the floorboards groaned under their feet. Cracks widened along the walls. Dust fell in thin streams from the ceiling. And then the floor split open again. This time, the circle of light was larger, wider, bright enough to hurt their eyes. Inside the circle, a stairway spiraled downward into pure darkness, each step glowing faintly as though alive. From deep below rose a strange wind, carrying with it the smell of rain and earth and something older, heavier. Impossible to name. The notebook's page filled with new words. One of you must follow. If no one chooses, the door will close forever, and all will be lost. The students shrank back further, shaking their heads in silence. None of them dared step forward. Some wept openly now. Others whispered prayers under their breath. Professor Elliot's breath came faster, his mind screaming at him to run, to leave, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But then his eyes caught on the boy's empty chair, still sitting at the center of the room, and for reasons he didn't fully understand, his feet began to move. He stepped closer to the circle of light, closer to the stairway. The heartbeat slowed slightly, as though waiting. Behind him, a few students reached out as if to stop him, but none of them spoke. The air was thick and heavy, and it seemed to press down on their voices, keeping them trapped in their throats. Professor Elliot stood at the edge of the stairway and looked down. He could see no bottom, only the faint glow of each step disappearing into infinite black. The notebook snapped shut behind him, loud as a gunshot. He turned and looked at the students one last time. Their faces were pale and full of fear, but behind that fear was something else, a strange kind of hope. as though they all knew that if he didn't go, none of them ever would. He nodded once, almost to himself, and stepped onto the first glowing step. The heartbeat quickened. He descended slowly, gripping the smooth stone wall for balance. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness pressed closer, so complete it seemed to swallow him whole. But there was something else in the dark. Sound. Not just a heartbeat now, but voices. Low, murmuring, layered on top of each other, speaking words he couldn't quite understand. Sometimes they sounded angry, other times mournful, but always full of urge. He kept walking. His breath came in short clouds now, the air freezing against his skin. After what felt like hours, the stairs opened into a vast underground chamber. He stopped at the threshold, unable to move forward, unable to look away. The chamber was massive, larger than any cathedral he had ever seen. The walls were carved with strange symbols that glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the floor. And at the center of the chamber lay the source of the heartbeat, a giant heart, asterisk. It hung in the air, suspended by nothing, pulsing slowly with deep crimson light. Veins of golden light spread outward from it, crawling across the walls and floor like roots. And standing just beneath it was the boy. His sweater was gone, now replaced by a thin robe of light that shimmered faintly, as though made of the storm itself. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and his hands were held out toward the heart as though holding it in place. Professor Elliot stared, his knees weak. What is this? He whispered. The boy looked at him then, and for the first time smiled. You found the heart of the storm, the boy said quietly. But the question remains, will you bear it, or will you let it die? Professor. Elliot opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The boy took a single step closer, and the golden veins flared brighter, spreading faster across the floor. The voices in the dark rose louder now, urgent and insistent. If you walk away, the boy said softly, everything ends. If you stay, you take my place. Professor Elliot's breath caught in his throat. Your place? The boy nodded once. The heartbeat slowed. The golden veins began to fade. And then the boy lowered his hands, and the great heart shuddered violently, its light dimming as cracks spread across its surface like breaking glass. Professor Elliot felt. His feet moved forward without thinking. The voices rose in a roar. The air turned hot, then cold, then so heavy he could barely stand. The boy extended a hand toward him. Decide. The boy said, his voice no longer soft but ringing through the chamber like a bell. Decide now, before the door closes. Professor Elliot reached out, his fingertips just inches from the boy's hand, and in that instant, the entire chamber shook. The heart cracked open with a deafening sound, and a blinding flash of light swallowed everything. Asterisk, the choice that broke the silence. Blinding light consumed everything. It was so bright and pure it burned through the darkness, through the chamber, through thought itself. Professor Elliot stumbled backward, shielding his eyes with both hands. The air around him felt alive now, thick and electric, humming with something he couldn't name. The roar of the voices grew louder, countless layers of sound pressing into his skull, each one shouting something different, yet all saying the same thing. Choose. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the light vanished. Silence fell over the chamber. But this was not the quiet from before. This was heavier, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow breath and thought, a silence that carried weight. The boy still stood in the center of the chamber, but he looked different now. The robe of light that had wrapped around him was frayed and dim. His hands trembled at his sides, and the glow in his eyes flickered faintly, as if the strength that had carried him this far was finally slipping away. Professor Elliot stared at him, his chest rising and falling, each breath shallow and sharp. The heartbeat of the giant heart had grown faint now, uneven and fragile. Small cracks raced across its surface like frost on glass. And with every crack, the golden veins that ran through the walls dimmed a little more. The boy turned his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. It won't hold much longer, he said. Elliot swallowed, his throat dry. What happens if it stops? The boy closed his eyes. Everything ends. Everything you know, everything you don't, this is the root of it all. Elliot looked at the heart again. It hung there, impossibly large, trembling slightly as though under a great strain. He took a step closer, then another, the ground warm beneath his shoes, the air around him pulsing faintly with each beat. He could feel it now. Not just the sound of the heartbeat, but the weight of it, the way it pulled at him, at everything inside him, like the center of some great tide. Why me? He asked finally, his voice cracking. Why? Why not someone stronger? Someone better? The boy opened his eyes then, and though his glow had faded, his gaze was steady. Because you're here, he said. Elliot shook his head. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. How am I supposed to? You don't have to know. The boy interrupted, his voice firmer now despite the weakness in his limbs. You just have to choose. To take it, to carry it. That's all. The silence in the chamber deepened again, as if the entire place were leaning in. Listening, Elliot took another hesitant step toward the heart. His hands trembled as he reached out, the air so hot now it stung his skin. The golden veins brightened slightly at his approach, and the heartbeat grew louder, stronger, as though sensing his decision. But then something moved in the shadows at the edges of the chamber. The darkness began to shift, curling upward into tall, jagged shapes. At first they looked like pillars of smoke, but then they sharpened into forms. Long limbs, hollow faces, eyes like burning coals staring out from the black. There were dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. They crept closer, silent and relentless, their eyes fixed on the boy and the professor. Elliot froze. What? What are they? He asked, his voice barely audible. The boy's eyes stayed on the heart. The ones who failed, he said simply. The shadows began to circle now. Their movements slow but purposeful, their long fingers scraping faintly against the floor. The voices returned too, but this time not as a roar. This time they were clear, whispering in unison, a low chant that filled the space between the beats of the heart. You cannot carry it. You will break, you will fail. You are nothing. The words cut through Elliot like knives. He felt his knees weaken under their weight, his breath quickening, his mind clouding with doubt. But then the boy spoke again, quiet but certain. Ignore. Them? Elliot tore his eyes away from the shadows and looked at the boy, who still stood straight despite his fading light. His shoulders squared, his gaze fixed firmly on the professor. They can't touch you if you choose, the boy said. But they will do everything they can to make you stop yourself. That's all they have left. Elliot swallowed hard. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the whispering, the heat, the pressure. His hand moved closer to the heart. The closer he came, the more he could feel it, not just the warmth, but the weight of it, pressing into his skin, into his chest, into his very soul. He could feel its pain too. The cracks that spider-webbed across its surface were not just breaking it, they were breaking him. Every flaw in the heart was a wound in himself. Every beat felt like a cry. And then the boy's voice came again, softer this time, as though from very far away. If you take it, you will not come back. You will not see the world above again. But they will. They all will. Elliot opened his eyes and looked at the boy one last time, and in that moment, he understood. He took the final step forward and pressed his palm flat against the heart. Then shadows screamed. Their whispers turned into a shriek so loud it rattled the walls. But Elliot stood firm. Golden light flared under his fingers, racing up his arm, through his chest, into his veins. The heat became unbearable. It felt as though he were being burned alive and frozen at the same time. But still he held on. The boy let out a long breath, and for the first time, a faint smile touched his lips. The light spread outward now, filling the chamber, brighter and brighter until everything else was swallowed by it. The heartbeat roared, steady and strong now, no longer fragile, but full and alive. The cracks in its surface sealed themselves one by one, until it shone whole and unbroken. The boy began to fade, his body dissolving into threads of light that rose upward, carried away by the golden veins. His voice echoed faintly, carried on. The wind? Thank you, he said. Professor Elliot gasped as the light coursed through him, his own body beginning to glow like molten gold, his feet lifting slightly from the floor as though the heart itself was pulling him in. And then everything went silent. Everything went still. The chamber was empty. The shadows were gone. The heart hung in perfect stillness, glowing softly in the quiet. And standing where the boy had stood was Professor Elliot, now wearing the same robe of light, his eyes faintly aglow, his hands still resting gently against. The heart high above, faint and distant, the storm began to clear. The first cracks of dawn touched the sky, but deep below, in the heart of the storm, a single sound continued, strong and steady. The heartbeat of the world. Asterisk. The dawn after the storm. Silence in the chamber was absolute. It stretched on and on, not empty, but full of something impossible to describe. A silence that was alive, watching, waiting. Professor Elliot stood motionless in the center, his palm still pressed to the great heart. The robe of light around him shimmered faintly, though his body felt impossibly heavy now, as though he bore the weight of the entire world upon his shoulders. And perhaps he did. He drew in a slow, shaky breath. The air was warm now, no longer oppressive, but strangely soft, like the calm after a long storm. The golden veins running across the walls glowed steady and strong, and the heartbeat, steady now, pulsed beneath his feet, no longer fragile, no longer broken. Elliot looked down at himself. The robe of light was no longer strange to him. It fit like it had always been there, woven into him somehow. The whispers of the shadows were gone, replaced by something else. A low, quiet hum that spoke not in words, but in feeling. Gratitude, relief, hope, asterisk.